Inside of JavaScript, there's a setTimeout function that can be used to create a delay if you want something to happen after a certain amount of time, to reload after, 5 seconds or something like that. The setTimeout would be a method of having that happen. That setTimeout works with callbacks, though. It does not work with promises. So what we're going to be doing is taking that setTimeout function and creating a way to consume it with promises. And through doing that, we're going to create it to where it meets the 4 criteria that I've outlined here. Promises really are nothing more than an object, so we'll go ahead and create a variable named prom that will store our new promise in, and then when you create a promise, you pass it a function, and that function is called the executor function, and that function provides 2 parameters, resolve and reject. Resolve and reject are both functions themselves. You invoke resolve when your promise is finished or fulfilled. This means that your promise was successful, essentially, and then you use reject if your promise encounters an error. So let's go ahead and set the timeout for 500 milliseconds and then pass it resolve. So setTimeout will call resolve after 500 milliseconds. Next, we go ahead and consume that promise by chaining on a then by saying prom.then. And then we hand that prom.then a function to execute once the promise has been resolved, and we log out that prom1 was fulfilled. So this code that we write here, that console.log, since it's being provided to .then, it will be called or executed when that promise is finished resolving. So to see that, let's go ahead and go back into our console and go ahead and run our code to see that that promise is being fulfilled. And at this point, we can go ahead and check item 1 off of our to-do list. Cool, so we have our first promise created, but the problem we're going to run into now is that the promise that we created, if we want it to do it again, we'd have to basically copy and paste that code to create a second promise to create a second delay. To get around this, let's go ahead and wrap this promise inside of a function and make it the return value. Now I want to point out that if you really want it to, you could just return the prom here, because the prom would be a different instance, but I'd prefer it. I think it looks a little bit cleaner if we just went ahead and said return new promise. So let's go ahead and do that. And so now if we go back down to our code, we can put in a second delay for 1000 milliseconds and go back to our console and see that we have prom1 fulfilled, prom2 fulfilled, and we can tell that prom2 is taking about twice the time of what prom1 was, which is the expected behavior. So now that we've went ahead and wrapped that promise inside of that function, we can now consider it reusable. So let's go ahead and check off item 2 from our to-do list of is easy to reuse and move on to making our promise reject. So let's say we want it to take our promise and pass it an invalid value such as -500. Well, you can't really time out for -500 seconds because that would be going back into the past. So let's go ahead and create logic inside of our promise that allows us to reject if something happens and the millis that are passed in are less than 0. So we'll go ahead and put that setTimeout in the else, but if the millis is less than 0, we want to reject and provided an error saying that, hey, doofus, you provided us millis less than 0. That really doesn't make any sense. So now if we come back down to our delay and then chain on the then would never be executed because this promise is going to reject since the input value of -500 is totally not valid. But if we chain on a .catch and provided a method, the .catch will be called because it'll check and see that the millis is less than 0. And so similar to the .then is called when the promise is fulfilled, this .catch will be called when the promise encounters an error, such as somebody provided an invalid input. So if we go back to our console, we'll see that prom1 is still being fulfilled, but prom2 rejects, and then it also prints out the error associated with it. And with that error, we get what is called a stack trace, which allows you to look at the code and see which line of code caused that problem to happen. So kind of a side note outside of what we're doing here, but if you look at that stack trace, you'd be able to go back and find what line of code triggered that problem to occur. That being said, we can go ahead and check item 3 off of our list since our promise now rejects if invalid input is provided. The last thing I want to do here is I want to go ahead and provide a console.time benchmark for each of the promises, no matter if the promise is successful or if the promise has failed. failed. So we have the dot, then we have the dot catch. Well, we also have the dot finally. Remember, dot then calls when we fulfill, and then dot catch calls when there's an error with their promise. Well, the dot finally is always going to call no matter what when our promise chain finishes executing. So we'll go ahead and tag on a dot finally to our promise chains to get this in place. But first, let's go ahead and create a console.time. And then that console.time is essentially saying, okay, I'm going to be keeping a time for something. And then by saying prom_1, we're giving it a unique ID that we want to benchmark against. So the next time we call console.timeIn with prom1, it'll get us the elapsed time between console.time and that console.timeIn call. And so now if we go back over to our console, you'll see that the second promise actually finishes much faster than the first one, just because of the fact it rejects immediately, and so it doesn't really do much work or doesn't sit around waiting. With that being said, we can go ahead and check off item number 4, provides console.time benchmarks for each promise chain after settled. That's it for this video. It was a quick little demo of solving a problem using promises inside of JavaScript. I hope you gained a little bit of knowledge about promises by doing it. And if you like the content, go ahead and like and subscribe.